Right. So my name is Akeel Bilgrami, and I'm a professor at Columbia University in New York. And I have been associated with the forum for some 5 years now. I go often to their meetings in Rhodes, and and I've come to this particular one because some of my recent work has been trying to explore how it is that the concept of nature got transformed into the concept of natural resources. So that was fitting for a conference on the environment, and my interest in it has so far primarily been historical, or what I call genealogical, which is to really try and uncover when it is that we began to think that one could take from nature with impunity, and with predatory sort of extractive economies. And in my study of this question, I put the fault line sometime in the late 17th century, when there was a very determined effort by scientists, but not really appealing to science so much as a sort of outlook around a new science that was emerging in the late 17th century, in which nature was desacralized. And this was not just a sort of theological claim, but it was a theological claim in the service of very commercial, mercantile interests. And the idea was that if nature could no longer be seen as having a sacred presence of the divine, then there were no constraints, as it were, theological or metaphysical constraints to taking from nature. People took from nature ever since they began to inhabit nature, but for centuries in pretty much every social world, when people took from nature, they nevertheless had rituals of reciprocation towards nature to restore respect to it. And this happened before cycles of planting and hunting, when one did take from nature. So, and before and after these cycles of planting and hunting. That's what disappeared in the late 17th century. And it disappeared because the new science was exploited by commercial interests and Orthodox Protestant Anglican interests in England first, and then it spread to Netherlands and Europe. And with nature desacralized and God moved to an external providential presence and role, matter and nature became brute and material. And it's then that I think commercial interests said, this now is, nature can now be defined as that which the natural sciences study, and there's nothing in nature that is not countenanced by the natural sciences. So value got removed from nature because natural sciences don't study value, and the sacred, of course, got removed from nature. And so much of my, that's the historical account, but some of my philosophical interest is to ask the question, even if today many people cannot believe that nature is sacralized, can they nevertheless believe that nature contains value properties which the natural sciences don't study? So right there is both H2O, which the natural sciences do study in that flowing river, but there's also value. And natural sciences don't study value. Now, it's true that many people don't believe that value has a sacred source anymore, but there isn't any reason why value can't exist as a property of that water right there without it having a sacred source. So in a way, I'm saying they threw away the baby with the bathwater when they evacuated nature and matter of all value simply because they wanted to evacuate it of the sacred and the divine. So that set of issues, both historical and genealogical and philosophical, has informed my interest, and I think in a way it's a very deep underlying source of our attitudes of disrespect towards nature, that we think of it. I mean, I think the first step in being predatory towards nature is to see it as merely brute and material, lacking in value properties, merely containing properties that the natural sciences study. There's nothing to give us pause then before we take from it. And so in my philosophical question is, can there be a secular re-enchantment of nature? That is, in the past, notions of enchantment were sacralized notions, and loss of belief in the presence of God is often described as disenchantment. For instance, Max Weber described it as disenchantment. And my question really is, can there be secular forms of enchantment? Yes. Now, Peter, who is a good friend of mine, has a view of animals which really has to do with their suffering. I mean, I think that's central to Peter's thinking, and I think he's absolutely right about that. There's an idiotic denial of the suffering in animals, which is just, craven, brutish behavior on the part of human beings, and it is a central ethical question in which Peter has taken very honourable stands. But I want to extend it to matter and nature, and I think, I really do think it is a superstition of modernity. It's a superstition of modernity to say that nature contains nothing but what the natural sciences study. By superstition, I mean nobody knows. We take it on trust, and nobody knows when it was proved. And certainly we don't know how it helps us to live better. Well, I believe that individuals very often actually have decent, compassionate responses to nature, to each other, and so on. I think what has happened is that because of the transformations that I was describing 3 centuries ago, you see, I really think that each one of us really thinks in 2 completely different frames. Psychologists call this the frame problem. So we think in a frame which is our quotidian individual frame, in which I just respond to the suffering of animals, the suffering of people, the beauties of nature, or the values in nature, and so on. And that's I think usually compassionate and humane and conserving of nature and caring. But then our minds surrender themselves to a whole public frame of mind, which has been for centuries now been dictated by these developments I was talking about this particular outlook in which natural science gets a kind of centrality as having full coverage of everything, and I think once our frame of mind has this quotidian. Our individual minds have this quotidian frame in which they think, but then they have this more public frame in which their minds have surrendered to this entire, well, there's nothing else to call it but ideology around, which defines nature along these lines, and which makes its alliances with commerce and industry and agribusiness. Agriculture is different from agribusiness. People live by agrarian methods for years, but they didn't see it as a source of runaway profits. So I think our mind works in both these frames, and really it's the public frame which I blame much more than the individual quotidian frame within which we think and respond to the world.
In terms of
Yeah, I think what we need to do is to start, in fact I think it should be the goal of politics to remove the border between these two frames so that we only have one frame and we can see the inconsistencies in our responses. I know people, putting nature aside, just take elementary examples. Somebody says, oh, this people in this ghetto, we must do something about it, they're suffering so much. And then you turn around the next minute and ask them, but should we raise taxes and spend money on welfare? Absolutely not. See, so the minds were, the quotidian frame is compassionate and humane, and then the minds in another frame have surrendered to the frame of the education, which is usually and what they read in newspapers and tabloids and so on, and they think completely different things, but they don't know they're being inconsistent because they're really thinking in two frames. So if they were to think in one frame, they might see the inconsistencies and come to a good resolution. But I really think that it's the business of politics, first of all, to remove the boundaries between these two frames, and then there may be some chance that we'll begin to think consistently and build a politics around it. Right. So I think to put it in a capsule form, the beginning of this transformation that I want to identify as a fault line is the desacralization of nature and the new definition of nature, which I think emerged in the middle and late 17th centuries, that there's nothing to nature that the natural sciences cannot study. And that meant not just removing the sacred, divine presence from nature, but removing value from nature. And that, because natural sciences don't study value, that I think is the underlying rationale which commercial interests and scientific interests began to exploit 300 years ago, to take from nature without feeling qualm any kind. And that's, I think, the beginning of the form of predatory extractive economies which have landed us with the environmental mess we're in.